7 a.m. Doorbell rings like a fire alarm. I stumble to the door expecting maybe a package delivery. Instead, two sheriff's deputies with clipboards, ready to serve me papers for, get this, parking my work truck in my own driveway. "Sir, we have an HOA violation notice requiring immediate..." Then my wife Sarah steps out behind me, full police uniform, Detective Lieutenant bars gleaming, steam rising from her coffee mug, mixing with the smell of fresh motor oil from my garage. Dead silence. You could hear the dew dripping off their patrol car windshield. The deputies looked like they'd rather be anywhere else on earth. One actually stepped backward on our gravel driveway crunch, suddenly realizing they're serving an HOA complaint to a detective's house. 6 months of pure harassment had led to this moment. Our HOA president finally pushed too far, and watching two grown men realize they'd been completely outplayed, pure gold. What would you do if your HOA called the cops on a cop? Share your HOA nightmare below. Misery loves company. Where are you watching from? I guarantee your neighborhood has its own wannabe dictator. Let me back up and tell you how I walked straight into this psychopath's crosshairs. My name's Marcus Hartwell, I'm 45, and 6 months ago I was getting financially butchered in the ugliest divorce this side of hell. My ex-wife weaponized our HOA bylaws like a sniper rifle, scheduling emergency meetings during my custody time, filing noise complaints when I started my truck at 7 a.m., even getting me fined for non-conforming holiday decorations, because my Christmas lights weren't the approved warm white. She got the McMansion, the BMW, and half my life savings. What I got was a masterclass in how petty tyrants use HOA rules to destroy lives and a blood oath to never live under another association's thumb. So when I started house hunting, I had one non-negotiable rule. No HOA, ever. I'd rather live in a shipping container than let some clipboard-wielding sociopath control my existence. That's how I found 1847 Millfield Road, a century-old farmhouse on 2.3 acres that had been in the same Polish family since World War II ended. The realtor mentioned it bordered some development called Stonegate Estates, but my property predated their HOA by 80 years and sat completely outside their jurisdiction. Perfect. I paid cash, moved in my tools, and thought I'd finally escaped suburban hell. The house had sole wooden floors that groaned like old bones, a workshop that reeked of honest work and motor oil, and a front porch where you could drink beer at noon without some architectural review board timing your grass growth. Stonegate Estates looked like someone had copy-pasted the same soulless design across 40 lots. McMansions in shades of bureaucratic beige with lawns so aggressively perfect they probably violated several laws of nature. The previous owners, the Kowalski family, had lived here peacefully for 50 years. According to Pete Garrison, who runs the hardware store and knows everyone's dirty secrets, they'd never had problems with HOA folks. Of course, that was before Hurricane Delilah made landfall, Pete warned me while mixing paint. That woman's got a black belt in making people disappear from neighborhoods. Delilah Vance had moved into Stonegate 6 months earlier and immediately launched a scorched earth campaign for HOA president, promising to eliminate non-conforming eyesores threatening our property values and family-oriented lifestyle. Her election flyers, which somehow infiltrated my mailbox like biological warfare, featured dramatic before and after photos of neighbors' yards with blood-red X's marking violations. Day job, insurance company middle management, specializing in claim denials and dream crushing. But her true calling was neighborhood dictator, complete with daily compliance patrols in her black Lexus, photographing everything with the obsessive dedication of a stalker building a case file. 3 weeks after moving in, I'm under my truck changing oil when I hear stilettos clicking on gravel like an execution countdown. Up walks Delilah, clutching a folder thick enough to stop bullets, wearing a smile that could give children nightmares. "Welcome to our community," she announced, shoving what she called a mandatory compliance orientation package at my oil-stained hands. Inside, HOA bylaws thicker than a Stephen King novel, annual dues demanding $850, and forms requiring pre-approval for everything from mailbox colors to the height of your damn grass. I wiped grease off my hands, genuinely confused. "Ma'am, wrong house. I'm not in your HOA." Her smile didn't just crack, it shattered like safety glass. Her left eye developed this predatory twitch, and for a split second I saw something genuinely unhinged flicker across her face. The kind of look that probably preceded several missing persons reports. "That's impossible." she hissed through clenched teeth, whipping out a hand-drawn map that looked like a preschooler's fever dream. You're clearly within our boundaries. I retrieved my actual survey documents' official papers with more stamps than a government conspiracy. See this line? Your development ends there. My property starts 15 feet east and has since 1943. Delilah stared at those documents like I'd just disproven her entire reality. Then she looked up at me with the kind of smile that serial killers probably practice in prison mirrors. "We'll see about that," she whispered, and I swear the temperature dropped 10 degrees. I should have called the cops right then. 2 weeks after the truck incident, Brenda discovered her new favorite weapon, city bureaucracy. Apparently, she'd been doing some detective work and found out I occasionally fixed cars for neighbors in my garage. Helping folks out, replacing brake pads for the teacher down the street, changing oil for the single mom next door. Basic community stuff that's been happening in American neighborhoods since cars were invented. But Brenda saw dollar signs and zoning violations dancing in her head like sugar plums at Christmas. She filed a complaint with the city claiming I was running an illegal home-based business without proper permits. The official letter demanded immediate inspection of my garage for commercial zoning violations and threatened daily $200 fines until all commercial activity ceased permanently. I'll give her credit. The woman had done her homework like a grad student cramming for finals. She'd researched city codes, found every potential loophole, and weaponized municipal regulations with surgical precision. My countermove was simple: fight bureaucracy with better bureaucracy. Back in the Navy, I'd learned that every regulation has another regulation that trumps it. You just need to find the right one. Turns out, vehicle repair for compensation does require a business license, which I'd obtained my first month out of the service. I'd also checked zoning laws before we bought the house. Our neighborhood allows home-based automotive repair as long as you're not running a full-scale dealership. I was completely legitimate and fully licensed. So I did something that probably made Brenda's eye twitch. I invited the city inspector myself, called them up, scheduled an appointment, and passed with flying colors. The inspector, a practical guy named Rodriguez who appreciated quality workmanship, complimented my organization and said my setup was textbook compliant. The familiar smell of motor oil and honest work apparently passed municipal standards just fine. I documented everything with military precision. Photos of the inspection, copies of all permits, timestamps on every interaction. Sarah had drilled this into my head from her fraud cases. When someone's playing dirty, documentation becomes your best weapon. I was learning that HOA battles follow the same rules as criminal investigations, but Brenda wasn't done. She had one more card to play, and it was a doozy. 3 days after my inspection victory, Sarah came home from work looking like someone had slapped her with a fish. She sat down at our kitchen table, still in uniform, and said, "You're not going to believe this." Brenda had filed a complaint about Sarah's police cruiser. Let that sink in. This woman actually claimed Sarah's department-issued patrol car violated the same commercial vehicle rule as my truck. She'd filed an official complaint with the police department about an officer violating community standards and creating an unprofessional atmosphere that makes families uncomfortable. The audacity was breathtaking. It was like complaining that firefighters park their trucks at the fire station. When Sarah told me the details, I felt something cold and sharp settle in my chest. Going after me was one thing. I could handle petty harassment. But targeting my wife's career? That was like poking a sleeping bear with a stick covered in honey and hoping for the best. Sarah handled it with the stone-cold professionalism of an 18-year veteran. She provided department documentation showing full compliance with take-home vehicle policies, explained the legal basis for police vehicle parking, and maintained perfect composure despite being personally attacked for doing her job. But I knew my wife. That night at dinner, the sound of her knife cutting through steak was sharper than usual. "She just made this about my career," Sarah said quietly. That was a serious mistake. The harassment campaign was spreading through the neighborhood like spilled paint on white carpet. Frank, our 73-year-old neighbor and Korean War vet, shuffled over the next morning with his coffee mug, looking more troubled than I'd ever seen him. His weathered hands gripped the ceramic handle like it was keeping him anchored. "Marcus, that Whitmore woman came by yesterday with a measuring tape. Says my fence is 2 inches too tall and needs to be lowered immediately." The fence had been standing since the neighborhood was built, approved by every inspection for 15 years. 2 inches, on a veteran's property. Then Jessica stopped by while pushing her toddler in a stroller. dark circles under her eyes telling the story of another sleepless night. She works the graveyard shift as a nurse, catches sleep when she can, does her best raising a kid alone. "I got a violation for leaving my stroller on the porch overnight," she said, voice trembling. Brenda called it unsightly storage that violated aesthetic guidelines. A stroller. For protecting her child's ride from the weather. Sarah had been taking notes during these conversations, her detective training kicking in automatically. That evening, she spread the paperwork across our dining table like she was working a case. "Look at this pattern," she said, pointing to dates and violations. "I've seen this before in discrimination cases. Some people get cited for everything. Others get complete free passes." She was right. From her fraud investigations, Sarah knew that selective enforcement could void an authority's right to enforce rules entirely. Courts don't like arbitrary punishment, especially when it follows suspicious patterns. The metallic snap of Brenda's measuring tape had become our neighborhood's soundtrack, echoing off driveways like a mechanical heartbeat of harassment. But we were done playing defense. Time to go on the offensive. Brenda's next move came straight out of the modern suburban warfare playbook, social media assassination. She created a Facebook group called Willowbrook Community Standards and started posting photos of our property with passive-aggressive captions that would make a middle school mean girl proud. "Some neighbors think rules don't apply to them," appeared under a photo of my perfectly compliant work truck. Another post showed our house with the caption, "When property values become negotiable," followed by 3 crying, laughing emojis. The woman was rallying her supporters with fear tactics about declining home values, painting us as the neighborhood troublemakers, who were somehow single-handedly destroying everyone's investment. The smell of desperation was stronger than the industrial-strength vanilla candles she probably had burning while typing these posts. But here's the thing about trying to shame a Navy veteran and a police detective on social media. We don't intimidate easily. I joined the group and started posting my own content. Time-stamped photos of my compliant property, documentation of my business license, even a shot of the city inspector's approval letter. When she posted about my excessive grass height, I responded with a photo of my grass next to a ruler showing 2.3 inches well within HOA guidelines, along with the caption, "Apparently my grass is too tall at 2.3 inches. Breaking out the nail scissors. Anyone know where to buy grass-specific tiny scissors?" The community response was mixed, but humor has a way of diffusing tension that righteous indignation can't match. Then things took a darker turn. Anonymous letters started appearing in neighbors' mailboxes. Not the usual HOA violation notices, but unsigned notes about declining property values and unwelcome elements in the neighborhood. These letters specifically mentioned commercial vehicle eyesores and suggested that increased police presence was making families feel unsafe. The language was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who'd been paying attention. These weren't complaints about actual rule violations. They were dog whistles about changing neighborhood character. Sarah read one of these letters with the cold focus she usually reserved for interrogating suspects. Her 20 years in law enforcement had taught her to recognize coded language when she saw it. "This is harassment with a side of discrimination," she said, photographing the letter with her phone. "And I'm pretty sure I know who's behind it." The paper matched the HOA's official stationery. The printer spacing and font alignment were identical to previous violation notices. Sarah filed an informal incident report for potential harassment patterns, though she kept it separate from our personal situation to avoid conflicts of interest. But Brenda wasn't finished playing dirty tricks. Her next escalation was brilliant in its pettiness. She fast-tracked a new rule through the architectural committee requiring prior approval for any exterior modifications. Then she retroactively applied it to my security cameras and workbench, demanding removal within 48 hours or face daily $100 fines. The timing was surgical. She'd bypassed the usual homeowner notification process, skipped the required comment period, and tried to create an emergency situation that would force immediate compliance. But I'd been doing my homework too. During my military service, I'd learned that every regulation has counter-regulations, and bureaucracy can be a two-edged sword. The HOA bylaws clearly stated that rule changes require 30-day advance notice to all homeowners. New rules cannot be applied retroactively to existing, compliant installations, and emergency rule changes can only address immediate safety hazards, not aesthetic preferences. Brenda had overplayed her hand, and Sarah's investigative instincts were picking up the scent of something bigger than petty neighbor disputes. The community was starting to fracture along predictable lines. Brenda's inner circle, mostly retirees worried about property values, supported her increasingly aggressive enforcement. But working families, military veterans, and younger parents were beginning to see the pattern of selective harassment. Frank mentioned that he'd received 3 violation notices in 2 weeks after decades of perfect compliance. Jessica discovered that her nursing schedule violated quiet hours when she left for work at 6 a.m., but the construction crew renovating the McMansion 3 streets over could start jackhammering at 7 a.m. without any complaints. The pool area became a battlefield of awkward encounters. Grocery store runs turned into strategic missions to avoid confrontation. Even Emma noticed the tension, asking why some of her friends' parents suddenly seemed uncomfortable around us at school events. Sarah was documenting everything with the methodical precision of a fraud investigation: dates, times, selective enforcement patterns, and the growing list of neighbors facing similar harassment. Her detective training had taught her that individual incidents might look random, but patterns reveal intent. That's when we realized we weren't just dealing with an overzealous HOA president. We were looking at something that smelled an awful lot like systematic discrimination, wrapped in the legal authority of community governance. The measuring tape snaps were getting more frequent, echoing through our neighborhood like a metronome counting down to something bigger. Brenda was escalating because she felt her authority being challenged, but she was also revealing the true scope of her operation. Sarah looked up from her growing file of documentation and said, "Marcus, I think we need to start thinking of this less like a neighbor dispute and more like a criminal investigation." That's when I knew Brenda had made her biggest mistake yet. She'd given a fraud detective a case to solve. Brenda's nuclear option came disguised as community safety concerns. She'd discovered a city ordinance about excessive noise during quiet hours and filed multiple noise complaints about my early morning vehicle repairs. Never mind that I'd already moved my start time to 8 a.m. as a goodwill gesture, Brenda had coordinated with her allies to document evidence with phone recordings and decibel measurements. The woman had turned Neighborhood Watch into a surveillance operation that would make the NSA jealous. She wasn't just filing random complaints either. These were strategic strikes designed to hit my business license where it hurt. The city takes noise violations seriously, especially when they involve commercial activities. Too many complaints could mean license revocation, which would shut down my mobile repair business permanently. But here's what 23 years of military problem-solving teaches you. When someone brings a knife to a gunfight, you don't just bring a bigger knife, you bring better intelligence. I installed a professional sound meter in my garage and started logging actual noise levels throughout the day. Turns out my impact wrench at 8:15 a.m. registered 68 decibels, well within city limits and quieter than the garbage trucks that rumbled through at 6:30 a.m. I documented everything: leaf blowers hitting 85 decibels at 7 a.m., construction work reaching 95 decibels by mid-morning, and the landscaping crew's equipment screaming at levels that could wake the dead. My excessive automotive work was actually among the quietest activities in the neighborhood. The smell of fresh-cut grass and 2-stroke engine exhaust filled the air every morning, but apparently only my tools were disturbing the peace. Then Brenda escalated with a move that caught us completely off guard. She hired a surveyor to challenge my driveway boundaries, claiming my work area extended onto common HOA property. The surveyor showed up with official equipment, measuring stakes, and clipboards thick enough to choke a horse. According to Brenda's new theory, my workbench sat 6 inches over an invisible property line, making it an unpermitted encroachment on community space. She demanded immediate cessation of all garage activities pending resolution of this boundary dispute. The timing was perfect. It created a legal gray area that could shut me down while the surveyor's findings were being disputed. Even if I eventually won, the delay could kill customer relationships I'd spent months building. But Sarah's fraud investigation experience had taught her something valuable. When someone suddenly discovers a boundary issue after months of harassment, it's usually manufactured evidence. She pulled our original property deed and the HOA master plan from county records, looking for discrepancies. What she found was interesting. The lot line descriptions in our deed didn't match the survey boundaries Brenda was claiming. There were inconsistencies in the measurements, and the common area designations seemed to have shifted mysteriously since the original development. "Marcus," Sarah said, spreading the documents across our dining table like a detective working a cold case. "Either this surveyor is incompetent or someone's been creative with property descriptions." Meanwhile, Brenda was creating paperwork avalanches designed to overwhelm us into submission. She filed an architectural violation for my unsightly storage, the workbench, a city code enforcement complaint for unpermitted structures, and demanded immediate responses to multiple agency inquiries. The strategy was obvious: create so much bureaucratic chaos that we'd give up rather than fight through the maze of appeals, hearings, and official responses. It was death by 1,000 paper cuts, and it was actually pretty brilliant. But she'd made one critical miscalculation. Sarah had spent 18 years navigating government bureaucracy, and I'd learned military-level organization during 2 decades of service. Paperwork wasn't our weakness, it was our home field advantage. I obtained retroactive building permits for my workbench installation, photographed all property improvements with GPS timestamps, and filed a formal grievance against the HOA board for harassment patterns. Every document was copied, dated, and organized with the precision of a military operation. Sarah helped me understand something crucial from her fraud cases. Property surveys can be challenged when they contradict recorded deeds. Your actual deed and title insurance policy trump HOA boundary claims every single time. We weren't just fighting about 6 inches of concrete, we were exposing potentially fraudulent property descriptions. The neighborhood pressure campaign was intensifying too. Brenda's supporters started parking across from our driveway, having casual conversations with other neighbors about property values, and creating social pressure at community events. The tennis court became a no-go zone, and even Emma's school functions felt like navigating a minefield. But something else was happening. Other neighbors were starting to share their own stories of selective enforcement and suspicious rule changes. The pattern was becoming too obvious to ignore, and people were getting tired of walking on eggshells around Brenda's arbitrary authority. Frank pulled me aside during one of his evening walks, his voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus, I've been keeping track. 15 families have received violations in the past 3 months. 15 families who all happen to be working class, military, or..." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Let's just say they don't fit Brenda's vision of the perfect neighborhood." That's when I realized we weren't fighting a property dispute or even harassment. We were documenting systematic discrimination, and Sarah's investigative instincts were about to uncover something much bigger than petty HOA tyranny. The sound of measuring tapes was constant now, but so was the sound of neighbors talking to each other, sharing stories, and realizing they weren't alone in this fight. The breakthrough came on a Tuesday night when I couldn't sleep. Sarah was working late on a case. Emma was at her friend's house, and I found myself sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a laptop, diving deep into public records like some kind of suburban detective. I'd started simple, just looking up HOA management company contracts to understand where our $400 monthly fees were actually going. What I found made that coffee taste like battery acid. Brenda was receiving $2,400 per month in consulting fees from Prestige Property Management, the company handling our HOA's day-to-day operations. $2,400 every month for a part-time volunteer position in a 200-home community. But it got worse. Cross-referencing the neighborhood improvement projects over the past 3 years, I discovered that 85% of HOA contracts went to Whitmore Construction, owned by Brenda's brother-in-law Derek. Pool maintenance, landscaping, snow removal, even the community mailbox repairs. All Derek, all overpriced, all approved without competitive bidding. When Sarah got home at midnight, I had documents spread across our dining table like a crime scene investigation. Her detective instincts kicked in immediately. "Show me the pattern," she said, settling into the chair across from me with her own cup of coffee. The pattern was beautiful in its corruption. HOA reserve funds should have contained around $400,000 based on 3 years of fees collected from 200 homes. Current balance, according to the most recent financial statement, $47,000. No explanation for the missing $353,000. Sarah pulled up her laptop and started cross-referencing contract dates with board meeting minutes. "Look at this," she said, pointing to a series of entries. "Emergency repairs, emergency landscaping, emergency snow removal, all approved without homeowner input, all going to the same contractor, all marked up by 40% over market rates. The management company contracts showed systematic overcharging on every service. What should have cost $15,000 for annual landscaping was billed at $21,000. Pool maintenance that ran $8,000 in comparable communities was costing us $12,500. Even trash collection was inflated. But here's what really caught Sarah's attention. Brenda's consulting payments had started the same month she'd pushed through new rules allowing the board to approve contracts under $25,000 without homeowner notification. Every single inflated contract came in at $24,900 or less. This isn't just corruption, Sarah said, her voice carrying the cold certainty of 18 years investigating financial crimes. This is organized fraud with a paper trail that leads straight back to systematic theft. Emma's school project had accidentally stumbled onto part of the evidence. She'd been researching community governance and discovered that HOA boards are required by state law to provide annual financial reports to homeowners. We hadn't received one in 2 years. The last published budget showed $180,000 in administrative costs for our 200-home community. Administrative costs that should have run maybe $30,000 annually were somehow 6 times higher, with no breakdown or explanation provided to homeowners. Sarah was in full detective mode now, pulling bank records and financial statements like she was preparing for a federal prosecution. Marcus, HOA board members have fiduciary duty to homeowners. Personal financial benefit from board decisions violates state nonprofit laws. What Brenda's doing isn't just unethical, it's criminal. The pieces were falling into place. Brenda's harassment campaign wasn't just about enforcing arbitrary rules or maintaining her authority. It was about protecting a financial scheme that had been systematically stealing from every family in our neighborhood for 3 years. Every violation notice, every selective enforcement action, every attempt to silence or intimidate questioning homeowners, it was all designed to maintain her control over a system that was making her and her family rich at our expense. Security footage Sarah had been reviewing showed Brenda accessing the HOA mailbox alone, multiple times, usually when financial statements should have been distributed. Neighbors reported never receiving promised budget reports or meeting notifications about major expenditures. The individual violations were never the real issue, Sarah said, leaning back in her chair as the full scope became clear. She's been running a protection racket disguised as community management. That's when we realized we weren't fighting a neighborhood bully anymore. We were looking at organized financial fraud, and Sarah's experience had taught her exactly how to build a case that would hold up in court. The power dynamic had just shifted completely, and Brenda had no idea what was coming. The next morning, my garage transformed from an auto repair shop into a war room. Sarah cleared her work schedule, I postponed client appointments, and we turned that space into something that looked like a federal investigation headquarters. Charts covered the walls tracking violation patterns, financial irregularities, and legal precedents. The smell of fresh coffee mixed with motor oil and determination. Sarah contributed her professional investigation techniques, carefully maintaining boundaries since this was off-duty work, but her 18 years of fraud cases had taught her exactly how to build an airtight corruption case. "We're not just fighting harassment anymore," she said, tacking up a timeline of Brenda's financial transactions. "We're exposing organized theft." Our first ally came shuffling over with his morning coffee. Frank, our 73-year-old Korean War veteran neighbor, had been keeping meticulous records since Brenda started measuring his fence. Turns out, military training dies hard. Frank had documentation going back 3 years, including HOA meeting minutes that mysteriously disappeared from official records. "I knew something was fishy," Frank said, spreading his papers across my workbench. "Board meetings with no notice, votes taken without quorum, contracts approved in executive session. In the Army, we called this kind of operation command corruption." Jessica, the exhausted single mother who'd been cited for her stroller, brought organizational skills honed by managing night shift nursing schedules. She'd been quietly connecting with other harassed families, building a network of neighbors who'd been suffering in silence. "We're not alone," Jessica announced, producing a list of 23 families facing selective enforcement. Everyone thought they were the only ones being targeted, but when you map it out, she pointed to addresses on a neighborhood diagram. There's a clear pattern of who gets harassed and who gets free passes. Robert, an accountant 3 houses down, volunteered to analyze the financial discrepancies with professional precision. What he discovered made our stomachs turn. The reserve fund should have contained $400,000 based on collected fees. Current balance, $47,000. But the missing money hadn't just vanished. It had been systematically transferred through inflated contracts and phantom administrative costs. "Look at this," Robert said, pointing to spreadsheet columns that told the story of organized theft. "Brenda's brother-in-law has received $286,000 in contracts over 3 years. Market rate for these same services should have been $180,000. That's $106,000 in pure markup split between family members." Maria, a real estate attorney who'd moved in 6 months ago, offered legal guidance that transformed our evidence gathering into a professional-grade investigation. She explained that most states allow homeowner recalls of corrupt HOA board members through petition processes requiring 25% of community signatures, followed by special elections. "But we have stronger options," Maria said, reviewing our documentation with the sharp focus of someone who'd handled white-collar crime cases. "Breach of fiduciary duty, fraud, and violation of state nonprofit laws. Brenda and her accomplices face personal liability that could include criminal charges and civil judgments." The beauty of our coalition was that everyone brought different expertise. Sarah taught us proper evidence collection techniques, emphasizing chain of custody and documentation standards that would hold up in court. I contributed military-style organizational systems for managing massive amounts of information. Robert provided forensic accounting skills that revealed the scope of financial manipulation. Meanwhile, Maria was building our legal strategy with surgical precision. She'd researched recent court cases where HOA board members faced personal liability for financial misconduct. The precedents were encouraging. Corrupt board members could lose personal assets, not just their positions, when they violated their fiduciary duties. "Here's what most people don't understand," Maria explained during one of our evening strategy sessions. HOA board corruption isn't just civil matters. When board members receive kickbacks and steer contracts to family members, they're committing fraud that can trigger criminal prosecution. Our technology integration came courtesy of Emma, who'd turned her school project into genuine community research. She created spreadsheets tracking neighbor violations versus enforcement patterns, geographic mapping that revealed demographic targeting, and timeline analysis showing how Brenda's harassment escalated whenever someone questioned financial decisions. The evidence was overwhelming. Pool maintenance contracts inflated by 40%. Landscaping services marked up 35%. Snow removal billed at twice market rate. Management company fees that were 200% higher than comparable communities. And sitting at the center of this web, Brenda's monthly consulting payments that had no basis in actual work performed. Sarah connected with a prosecutor friend during a casual lunch, asking general questions about HOA fraud cases without mentioning our specific situation. The advice was encouraging. Financial crimes involving homeowner associations were taken seriously by state attorney general offices, especially when they involved systematic theft and discriminatory enforcement. We were planning our public revelation for the annual homeowners meeting, which was mandatory attendance and traditionally held in the community center. Robert had prepared a comprehensive financial presentation that would expose 3 years of theft in language everyone could understand. Maria had drafted formal complaints ready for filing with the state attorney general's office. Sarah had organized all evidence according to criminal investigation standards. But we also prepared for Brenda's inevitable counterattacks. We anticipated denial, victim blaming, legal threats, and attempts to claim harassment against us. Our contingency planning included documentation protocols to prevent false accusations and media contacts who'd already expressed interest in HOA corruption stories. The smell of justice was starting to overpower the vanilla candle smoke that had dominated our neighborhood for too long. Brenda's desperation became obvious when she started playing truly dirty. The first sign was my work truck, both rear tires slashed overnight in our driveway. Clean cuts, not random vandalism, done with surgical precision by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The timing was surgical too. Our security cameras had mysteriously malfunctioned during the exact 2-hour window when the sabotage occurred. The main camera's power cable had been disconnected, and the backup system showed nothing but static. Someone with intimate knowledge of our security setup had planned this attack. I discovered the damage at 6 a.m. when I went to load tools for a morning appointment. The hiss of escaping air mixed with the smell of rubber and my own rising anger. $200 in tire replacement, a missed appointment, and a clear message: back down or face escalation. But here's what Brenda didn't understand about military training: sabotage just makes us more determined. I installed a backup security system with cellular connectivity and cloud storage that same day. Hidden cameras, motion sensors, and battery backup systems that couldn't be disabled from outside. If someone wanted to play surveillance games, I'd make sure we had the better equipment. Brenda's smear campaign kicked into overdrive with professional quality flyers appearing on windshields throughout the neighborhood. Not homemade printouts, but glossy materials with sophisticated graphics warning about protect our property values and neighborhood safety concerns. The messaging was carefully crafted to sound reasonable while spreading fear. Claims that harassment and intimidation tactics were being used against board members. Suggestions that increased police presence was making families uncomfortable. Warnings about outside agitators threatening community stability. Anonymous 911 calls started flooding in, reporting suspicious activity at our address. 3 times in 1 week, patrol cars showed up responding to reports of unusual noise, possible break-ins, and domestic disturbances. Each time, the responding officers found nothing but apologized for the obvious harassment. Sarah's colleagues were getting tired of the false reports, and their patrol supervisor was starting to document a pattern of abuse. What Brenda thought was intimidation was actually creating an official record of her escalating harassment campaign. The poison pen letters became more aggressive, with unsigned notes warning neighbors about retaliation by police families and threatening legal action against anyone supporting our harassment campaign. These letters suggested property values were declining due to ongoing conflict and hinted that families should pressure us to move for everyone's benefit. But Brenda's masterpiece came when she filed a false police report claiming I'd threatened her during a confrontation at the community mailbox. According to her statement, I'd made intimidating comments about her getting what she deserved and mentioned Sarah's police connections in a threatening manner. The irony was beautiful. She'd filed a harassment complaint against a detective's husband with the detective's own department. Sarah had to recuse herself from any official involvement due to conflict of interest, but the investigating officers knew quality evidence when they saw it. My security footage told a different story. The confrontation she described never happened. The timestamp showed I'd collected mail at 3:17 p.m. while she was clearly visible in her driveway at 3:45 p.m., nearly 30 minutes later. The GPS data from my phone confirmed I'd been at a client's house during her alleged incident time. When confronted with video evidence that contradicted her sworn statement, Brenda's story shifted faster than a politician during election season. Suddenly it was a misunderstanding about timing, then a confusion about which day the incident occurred. But filing false police reports is a crime in all 50 states, and Sarah's colleagues weren't amused by obvious attempts to manipulate law enforcement for personal vendettas. The investigating sergeant suggested that making false statements could result in criminal charges, which seemed to cool Brenda's enthusiasm for involving police in HOA disputes. The financial pressure campaign escalated too. HOA attorneys sent demand letters for accumulated violation fines now totaling $3,200, threatening foreclosure proceedings for unpaid penalties. The legal letterhead was designed to intimidate, but Maria's review revealed numerous procedural violations in how the fines had been assessed. Emergency rules implemented without proper notice, retroactive penalties for previously compliant installations, and selective enforcement that violated due process requirements. The HOA's own attorney had created a liability nightmare by rubber-stamping Brenda's illegal enforcement actions. Other questioning homeowners received similar demand letters, creating artificial urgency to force settlements before our planned annual meeting presentation. Frank got hit with $1,800 in accumulated fines. Jessica faced $950 for various violations of rules that seemed to change weekly. The strategy was obvious: bankrupt resistance through legal costs and financial pressure. But it was also creating a growing coalition of neighbors who realized they were all being systematically robbed and harassed by the same corrupt system. The community fractures were deepening, but not the way Brenda expected. Some neighbors distanced themselves to avoid conflict, but others rallied closer after witnessing obvious abuse of authority. School events became uncomfortable as parents chose sides, but working families and younger parents increasingly supported accountability over arbitrary power. Sarah maintained perfect professional composure despite personal frustration. but I could see the cold determination in her eyes that usually appeared when she was closing in on a major fraud case. Every harassment incident was documented with law enforcement precision, building an evidence file that looked more like a federal investigation than a neighborhood dispute. Brenda was escalating because she felt cornered, but she was also revealing the full extent of her corruption and creating evidence that would destroy her completely. Brenda's nuclear option arrived on that Tuesday morning I mentioned at the beginning, the moment she finally overplayed her hand by calling actual police to our door. But let me tell you what led up to that frozen moment when two deputies realized they'd been played. The week before, Brenda had orchestrated her masterpiece of manipulation. She'd compiled a thick folder of evidence documenting my illegal business operations and harassment of board members. Photos of my work truck, recordings of normal automotive repair sounds, and a timeline of what she called escalating aggressive behavior. The folder looked professional, organized, and completely damning if you didn't know the real story. She'd spent weeks preparing this presentation, timing it for maximum impact when she could claim to fear for her safety and the community's well-being. Her complaint to the sheriff's department painted me as a dangerous individual running illegal operations and intimidating neighbors who tried to enforce community standards. She claimed Sarah was using her police position to protect criminal activity and threaten law enforcement action against HOA board members. The sheer balls of this woman accusing a decorated detective of corruption while running her own theft operation. But here's what Brenda didn't anticipate. The responding deputies were professionals who knew Sarah from department interactions. When they arrived expecting to serve papers on some neighborhood troublemaker, they found themselves face-to-face with Detective Lieutenant Sarah Chen, whose reputation for integrity was legendary throughout the department. That frozen moment when Sarah stepped out in full uniform, steam rising from her coffee mug in the crisp morning air, was beautiful in its devastating simplicity. You could hear the morning dew dripping off their patrol car windshield as both deputies realized they'd been sent on a fool's errand by someone who'd seriously misjudged the situation. "Ma'am," one deputy said, his voice carrying the careful respect reserved for senior officers, "we have a complaint about HOA violations and possible harassment. We weren't aware this was your residence." Sarah handled it with the stone-cold professionalism that had earned her 18 years of department commendations. She invited them inside for coffee, reviewed their paperwork with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen every scam and manipulation tactic in the book, and calmly explained the jurisdiction differences between HOA rules and actual city ordinances. "Gentlemen," Sarah said, spreading my business licenses across our kitchen table, "HOA violations are civil matters requiring civil court proceedings. You can't arrest someone for parking their legally licensed work vehicle in their own driveway or for having grass that's allegedly too tall." She provided documentation showing my business compliance, noise level measurements proving I operated within city limits, and evidence of the systematic harassment campaign we'd been documenting for months. The deputies left with a clear understanding of who was actually causing problems in our neighborhood. The backfire effect was immediate and spectacular. Word spread through the neighborhood faster than gossip at a church potluck. Brenda called the cops on the cops became the story everyone was talking about, and her credibility evaporated like morning mist. Social media buzzed with commentary about HOA overreach and abuse of police resources. Emma's classmate's parent, who worked for the local newspaper, caught wind of the story and requested interviews. HOA board president calls police on detective's family made for compelling headlines that put Brenda in an extremely uncomfortable spotlight. The media attention forced Brenda into defensive mode for the first time since this whole mess started. Suddenly, she was explaining her actions to reporters instead of controlling the narrative through her Facebook group and whisper campaigns. Our security footage captured the entire police visit, providing undeniable documentation of the harassment escalation. Audio recording legal in our state preserved Brenda's accusations and the deputy's professional handling of an obvious manipulation attempt. The contrast was striking. Calm homeowners providing documentation and evidence versus an agitated HOA president making wild accusations that couldn't withstand basic scrutiny. The community rallying point was unmistakable. Neighbors who'd been fence-sitting suddenly witnessed obvious police misuse attempts and realized how far Brenda was willing to go to maintain control. Other harassment victims emerged from the shadows with similar stories of escalating intimidation. Frank organized an informal gathering at the community center, where 23 families shared experiences of selective enforcement, financial irregularities, and systematic harassment. The pattern was undeniable when viewed collectively, and the annual homeowners meeting attendance was approaching record levels. Maria advised us that harassment lawsuits were definitely viable given the documented escalation pattern. Civil rights violations were possible due to discriminatory enforcement targeting working-class families and veterans. False police report charges could apply to Brenda's complaint, though Sarah's department would handle that carefully to avoid appearance of retaliation. Our financial investigation was complete, with Robert's forensic accounting revealing $347,000 in questionable expenditures over 3 years. The state attorney general complaint was prepared with supporting documentation that would make federal prosecutors jealous. But the most important outcome was psychological. Brenda had revealed her desperation by involving law enforcement in civil disputes, showing the community that she'd lost control and was grasping for any authority that might restore her power. The annual meeting was 2 weeks away, and our coalition was ready. We had the evidence, the community support, and the legal framework to expose 3 years of systematic corruption. More importantly, we had the moral authority that comes from being obviously right in a fight against obvious corruption. Brenda's last-ditch attempt to silence us through police intimidation had backfired completely, transforming us from neighborhood complainers into sympathetic victims of obvious abuse of power. The measuring tape symphony was about to reach its final crescendo. The community center had never seen anything like it. 180 homeowners, 90% of our neighborhood, packed into a space designed for maybe half that number. Folding chairs lined the walls, people stood in the back, and the air buzzed with anticipation that you could practically taste. Local reporter Janet Morrison sat in the front row with her photographer, notepad ready. Maria had positioned herself strategically with recording equipment, both as our legal counsel and as a homeowner documenting potential evidence. The smell of nervous energy mixed with industrial coffee and the faint vanilla scent that seemed to follow Brenda everywhere. Brenda attempted to control the chaos from her usual position behind the board table, but her confident facade was cracking like cheap paint in summer heat. She'd clearly expected the usual dozen attendees who normally showed up to these mandatory meetings, not a packed house ready for revolution. "This meeting will follow standard procedures," Brenda announced, her voice slightly higher than usual. "Individual speaking time is limited to 2 minutes per person and will address only items on the official agenda." But Robert stood up before she could continue, his accountant's precision cutting through her attempt at crowd control. "Point of order. State law requires financial disclosure at annual meetings. We haven't received financial statements in 2 years, which violates statutory requirements." Brenda's face flushed pink. "Financial matters will be addressed under new business." "No," Maria interrupted, rising with the authority of someone who'd handled corporate fraud cases. "Financial disclosure is mandatory, not optional. This meeting cannot proceed legally without providing required documentation to homeowners." The room erupted in murmurs and shifting chairs. Brenda was losing control of her own meeting before it officially started, and everyone could see the panic in her eyes. "I requested the floor under old business to address systematic harassment and selective enforcement." Brenda tried limiting my time, but the crowd wasn't having it. Someone shouted, "Let him speak," and others picked up the call until she had no choice but to yield. I presented our timeline methodically, like briefing military command on a mission-critical situation. Photos of selective enforcement, documentation of harassment escalation, evidence of discriminatory targeting. The room stayed dead silent except for the occasional gasp when neighbors realized the scope of what we'd uncovered. "This isn't about individual violations," I concluded, making eye contact with faces throughout the crowd. "This is about abuse of power, systematic theft, and corruption that's been stealing from every family in this room." Then Robert dropped the financial bombshell. His presentation was devastating in its simplicity. Charts showing reserve fund depletion, contract analysis revealing systematic overcharging, documentation of kickback schemes that had drained nearly $350,000 from community funds over 3 years. "Your HOA fees were supposed to maintain this community," Robert said, his voice carrying across the packed room. "Instead, they've been financing a family business operation that's made Brenda Whitmore and her relatives rich at your expense." The silence was deafening. You could hear someone's coffee cup clinking against a saucer in the back row. Sarah spoke next, carefully identifying herself as a homeowner rather than a police officer, explaining the legal implications of board member conflicts of interest and systematic financial misconduct. Her 18 years of fraud investigation experience made every word carry weight that crushed Brenda's remaining credibility. "What we're looking at," Sarah said with clinical precision, "meets the legal definition of organized fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and violation of state nonprofit laws." Jessica presented the petition signed by 89 homeowners demanding immediate board recall. Frank read names of 23 families subjected to selective enforcement, while others received free passes for identical violations. Emma presented her demographic analysis showing clear targeting patterns that looked suspiciously like discrimination. The community voice was overwhelming, unstoppable, and absolutely damning. Brenda's desperate defense crumbled in real time. She denied accusations while being confronted with documented evidence, claimed ignorance of financial irregularities while receiving monthly consulting payments, and threatened legal action against slanderous accusations that were backed by bank records and contracts. "This is a coordinated attack by disgruntled troublemakers," she said, her voice cracking under pressure. "These people have been harassing board members and disrupting community harmony." That's when Maria delivered the mic drop moment. She stood slowly, holding a thick folder that contained our state attorney general complaint, and said in a voice that carried to every corner of the room, "Mrs. Whitmore, this folder contains evidence of criminal fraud and breach of fiduciary duty. Your board members can resign tonight and cooperate with authorities, or they can face criminal charges and personal liability for financial misconduct." The silence that followed was complete. No coffee cups clinking, no papers rustling, no one even breathing audibly. "Your choice," Maria continued, "but this complaint gets filed tomorrow morning regardless. The only question is whether you face charges as cooperative witnesses or criminal defendants." Brenda's face went from pink to white to gray in the span of 10 seconds. The other board members were already looking for exits, literally and figuratively, realizing they'd been accessories to systematic theft. The voting was swift and brutal. 156 to 12 to remove the entire board, unanimous approval for financial audit, 167 to 1 to pursue criminal charges against Brenda and her accomplices. Justice served with a side of public humiliation, exactly as ordered. Justice moved faster than anyone expected. Within 30 days, the state attorney general launched a formal investigation that made federal fraud cases look casual. Brenda faced criminal charges for breach of fiduciary duty, conspiracy to commit fraud, and theft of community funds. Her brother-in-law's construction company was barred from all HOA work statewide, and their personal assets were frozen pending restitution hearings. The civil lawsuit filed by our homeowners association recovered $278,000 in stolen funds, plus penalties and interest that brought the total settlement to nearly $400,000. Prestige Property Management terminated their contract rather than face prosecution, and we hired a local firm that charged half their rates while providing twice the transparency. Our new board elected in a special election that saw record turnout, eliminated all selective enforcement policies, and implemented monthly financial reports published online with full transparency. Community advisory committees were established for major decisions, and no single person could approve contracts over $5,000 without homeowner notification. The personal vindication felt incredible, but the community healing was even better. All previous violation notices were rescinded and fines refunded with interest. Frank's fence stayed exactly where it was. Jessica's stroller found permanent residence on her porch without fear of citation, and my work truck earned a designated parking spot that became a neighborhood landmark. I was elected HOA president in a unanimous vote, which felt surreal considering I'd started this journey just trying to park my truck in my own driveway. Sarah became our financial oversight officer, using her fraud investigation skills to ensure community funds were protected and properly managed. The ripple effects extended far beyond Willowbrook Estates. Our story was picked up by regional news outlets and HOA reform organizations, inspiring other communities to examine their own financial management. State legislation was proposed to strengthen HOA oversight requirements and protect homeowners from board corruption. Other communities reached out for advice on similar situations, and Sarah developed an informal expertise in HOA fraud investigation that led to speaking engagements at state conferences. We became inadvertent advocates for community governance reform, helping families fight corruption they'd previously suffered in silence. Emma received the first annual Willowbrook Community Scholarship, established with recovered funds to support local students pursuing public service careers. Her school project documenting our HOA reform became the template for a statewide civic engagement curriculum. Our sweet kid who'd believed in fairness had helped create a system that actually delivered it. The recovered funds transformed our community in ways Brenda's corruption never could. We established a genuine community garden on previously unused common area, organized annual festivals that brought neighbors together for celebration instead of conflict, and created a neighborhood watch program focused on helping elderly residents rather than measuring grass height. Property values actually increased once word spread about our transparent governance and community spirit. Turns out buyers prefer neighborhoods where democracy works over places where petty dictators measure fence heights with rulers and stopwatches. The biggest change was emotional. Walking through our neighborhood no longer felt like navigating a minefield of arbitrary rules and potential violations. Kids rode bikes without fear of citations. Families hosted gatherings without measuring noise levels, and the community pool became a place for relaxation instead of social warfare. Frank's morning walks resumed their leisurely pace, no longer interrupted by measuring tape symphonies. Jessica's nursing schedule was respected as essential community service rather than noise violation. The vanilla candle smell that had dominated Brenda's reign was replaced by the honest sense of barbecue grills, fresh flowers, and children playing outdoors. For anyone facing similar HOA nightmares, remember that knowledge truly is power, documentation provides protection, and communities are always stronger when they stand together against corruption. Your HOA board works for you. If they're stealing, lying, or discriminating, you absolutely can fire them and hold them accountable. Most importantly, don't let petty tyrants convince you that fighting back isn't worth the effort. Sometimes standing up for what's right transforms entire communities and creates lasting positive change that benefits everyone. Drop your HOA horror story in the comments below. You're definitely not alone in this fight. And sharing experiences helps others realize they have options beyond suffering in silence. And don't forget to subscribe for more justice-served stories where good people refuse to back down and the bad guys get exactly what they deserve. Hit that notification bell so you never miss the moment when ordinary folks prove that corruption can't survive when communities decide to fight back together. The sound of children laughing in our newly established playground, built with recovered funds where Brenda once measured grass with rulers, remains the sweetest victory music I've ever heard. Sometimes the best revenge really is living well and building something better from the ashes of someone else's corruption.